Imagine standing before a sealed stone door buried beneath 2,000 years of dust. On its surface, no inscription, no map, no explanation, only silence. Behind that door lies one of the greatest missing chapters in human history. We know how Jesus entered the world. We know how his final years transformed civilizations, inspired empires, and reshaped the spiritual imagination of billions. Yet between the child who astonished teachers in the temple and the man who emerged from the waters of the Jordan River, there stretches a vast and unsettling void. Nearly 2 decades disappear into darkness. No eyewitness account, no detailed biography, no surviving record capable of telling us where he went, what he learned, whom he met, or how the figure history remembers was ultimately formed. For centuries, that silence has acted like a magnet. Mystics, historians, theologians, and storytellers have all attempted to fill the gap. Some imagined secret journeys to distant lands. Others proposed hidden schools of wisdom, forgotten teachers, or lost manuscripts buried beneath the sands of time. Yet the deeper one ventures into the evidence, the stranger the mystery becomes. Because the most influential life in recorded history appears to emerge from one of history's greatest silences. Tonight, we are not searching for legends. We are not searching for comforting traditions. We are opening an investigation. What happened during the missing years of Jesus of Nazareth? Why do our earliest sources say so little? And could the silence itself be hiding something more important than any lost story ever could? To understand the mystery of the missing years, we must first leave behind the silence of the sources and step into the world that shaped them. The land was Judea, a restless frontier of the Roman Empire. Stone roads carried merchants, soldiers, tax collectors, and pilgrims across a landscape where political power and religious devotion collided almost daily. To the south stood Jerusalem, crowned by the Temple Mount. Its gleaming sanctuary dominated both the skyline and the imagination of the Jewish people. Here sacrifices were offered, festivals gathered thousands, and ancient prophecies seemed to breathe through every courtyard and column. Yet Jesus did not grow up in Jerusalem. He grew up in Galilee, far to the north, in the small village of Nazareth. Surrounded by rocky hills and terraced fields, Nazareth was not a center of wealth or learning. It was a place of labor, a place where seasons dictated survival and where most lives passed unnoticed by historians. The people spoke Aramaic. They prayed in Hebrew. They lived under Roman authority while clinging fiercely to ancestral traditions that stretched back centuries. This was also an age of expectation. Many Jews believed history was approaching a decisive turning point. Foreign rulers occupied the land promised to their ancestors. Prophetic writings were studied with renewed intensity. Some waited for a king descended from David. Others anticipated a priest, a prophet, or a heavenly deliverer who would restore Israel. Different groups offered different answers. Pharisees debated the law. Sadducees guarded the temple hierarchy. Essenes withdrew into isolated communities seeking purity before the coming judgment. Beneath the surface of ordinary life, a profound tension was building. It was a world shaped by hope, frustration, devotion, and longing. And somewhere within that world, hidden from the historical record, the young Jesus was growing into the figure who would eventually emerge onto the stage of history. Imagine for a moment that the missing years of Jesus were painted not as a historical record, but as a sacred icon hanging in the shadowed interior of an ancient sanctuary. At the center of the image stands a solitary figure, not the teacher surrounded by crowds, not the miracle worker walking upon the sea, not the crucified Messiah beneath a darkened sky. Instead, a young man wrapped in simple garments, almost hidden within the composition itself. Around him rises the landscape of Galilee, rendered in muted earth tones of ochre, dust red, and weathered stone. The hills appear silent, their contours softened by the pale gold light of dawn. Above them stretches a vast sky suspended between darkness and illumination, as though the world itself is waiting for something that has not yet happened. In the distance stands Jerusalem. Its temple gleams like a mountain of white fire against the horizon, reflecting the first light of morning. The architecture dominates the background, not merely as a building, but as a symbol. It represents covenant, memory, sacrifice, and the invisible presence of God dwelling among his people. yet the figure remains far away from it. Between the young man and the sacred city lies an expanse of valleys, roads, and years that no source fully records. The most striking feature of the image is not what is shown. It is what remains concealed. Shadows gather around the edges of the composition. Doorways lead into darkness. Paths disappear behind ridges of stone. The artist seems determined to draw the eye toward absence itself. Every color, every beam of light, every silent structure points toward a mystery rather than a revelation. The figure is illuminated, yet his story remains hidden. He stands at the threshold between obscurity and destiny, between ordinary life and sacred mission. And it is precisely that unresolved tension that gives the image its strange and enduring power. As soon as we move beyond the silence of the sources, we enter a landscape of competing theories, unresolved questions, and historical tensions that have persisted for centuries. The first conflict is deceptively simple. Did Jesus spend these missing years living an ordinary life in Galilee? Or was something far more extraordinary taking place beyond the view of the historical record? Many scholars argue that the simplest explanation remains the strongest. The earliest sources place Jesus in Nazareth before his ministry and offer no indication that he traveled widely. From this perspective, the missing years may not be missing at all. They are merely unrecorded because they contain nothing the gospel authors considered essential to their message. Yet others remain unconvinced. The difficulty with that interpretation is that it leaves an enormous silence surrounding the formative years of one of history's most influential figures. For some researchers, that silence itself demands explanation. This has led to alternative theories. Some point toward Egypt, a land deeply connected to Jewish history and early Christian tradition. Others look eastward, proposing contact with distant centers of wisdom in Persia or even India. These theories attempt to explain perceived similarities between certain teachings and broader religious traditions. Yet the strongest evidence for such journeys remains frustratingly thin. The historical record offers possibility rather than confirmation. A second conflict emerges within theology itself. Why did the gospel writers choose silence? Some scholars argue that their purpose was never biographical. Their concern was the public mission of Jesus, not the details of his private life. Others suggest that valuable traditions may simply have been lost before the texts were written. Neither position can be proven conclusively. The evidence supports elements of both. And this is where the investigation becomes more complicated. Every proposed solution appears to answer one question while creating another. The deeper we move into the mystery, the more the missing years seem less like a gap in the story and more like the story itself. When historians encounter silence in the primary sources, they often turn their attention to the margins of tradition, to forgotten manuscripts, disputed texts, and stories that survived outside the boundaries of the official canon. It is here, in the shadows of early Christian literature, that the missing years of Jesus begin to acquire unexpected detail. One of the most intriguing examples comes from a collection of writings known today as the Infancy Gospels. These texts, composed generations after the events they describe, attempt to fill the gaps left by the canonical accounts. In some versions, the young Jesus is portrayed performing astonishing miracles long before his public ministry. Clay birds are said to take flight. Teachers are left speechless by his wisdom. Ordinary childhood encounters become scenes of supernatural significance. Yet the historical value of these stories remains highly debated. Most scholars view them not as eyewitness testimony, but as later devotional literature, created by communities struggling with a question that still fascinates readers today. What was Jesus like before the beginning of his ministry? Other traditions point in different directions. Certain medieval narratives speak of journeys beyond Judea. Fragments of later legends place Jesus amongst sages, seekers, and distant lands. Some scholars argue these accounts preserve echoes of older traditions now lost. Others remain unconvinced, noting that such stories emerge centuries after the events they claim to describe and often lack independent corroboration. The difficulty with these traditions is not that they are impossible. It is that the evidence supporting them is remarkably fragile. Yet their existence reveals something important. Across centuries and cultures, people repeatedly attempted to illuminate the same historical darkness. The hidden texts do not necessarily tell us where Jesus went. they tell us something equally revealing. They show how deeply the silence of the canonical record unsettled the imagination of those who inherited it. Sometimes the most fascinating evidence is not what a text claims to reveal, but why that text felt compelled to exist at all. The deeper we investigate the missing years of Jesus, the more the mystery begins to function not merely as a historical problem, but as a powerful symbol embedded within the structure of the narrative itself. In ancient literature, absence often carries meaning just as significant as presence. What is omitted can sometimes reveal as much as what is recorded. This raises a deeper question. Why does the story move from the child in the temple directly to the man at the Jordan River, leaving nearly 2 decades concealed between them? From a historical perspective, the silence may simply reflect the interests of the gospel authors. Ancient biographies rarely followed the expectations of modern historical writing. They focused on the significance of a person's public mission rather than documenting every stage of life. Yet from a symbolic perspective, the missing years resemble a threshold. Throughout the religious imagination of the ancient Near East, transformative figures often pass through a hidden period before entering their calling. Archaeology cannot prove the symbolic intention behind such patterns, but comparative study reveals that withdrawal, preparation, and obscurity frequently appear as narrative motifs associated with wisdom, authority, and spiritual formation. The village of Nazareth itself acquires symbolic weight. Historically, it was a small and relatively insignificant settlement. Yet within the literary structure of the gospel tradition, that very obscurity becomes meaningful. Great kingdoms emerge from capitals. Empires emerge from palaces. Yet this story begins in a place that few ancient writers considered important. Some theologians interpret this as a deliberate reversal of worldly expectations. Others caution against reading too much symbolism into historical circumstance. Both perspectives deserve consideration. What remains striking is that the hidden years transform ordinary life into part of the sacred narrative. The silence suggests that preparation matters. The years before the mission matter. The unseen process matters. Whether viewed through theology, literature, or history, the missing years appear to symbolize a truth larger than biography itself. The most decisive transformations often occur beyond the reach of public attention. Every historical mystery eventually reaches a point where the evidence becomes thin and speculation begins to flourish. The missing years of Jesus are no exception. Among the most controversial interpretations are those that place him far beyond the borders of Galilee, into intellectual and spiritual worlds rarely discussed within mainstream scholarship. One of the most enduring theories proposes that Jesus traveled to Egypt during his early adulthood. At first glance, this idea appears less radical than it sounds. Egypt held a significant place within Jewish history, and the gospel tradition itself preserves an account of Jesus' family seeking refuge there during his childhood. Some researchers have wondered whether later journeys may have occurred as well. Yet the historical record offers no direct evidence. The theory remains possible, but largely unverified. More controversial still are claims that Jesus journeyed eastward to Persia, India, or even regions associated with early Buddhist traditions. These interpretations gained popularity centuries later and often rely on texts whose origins, dating, and reliability remain heavily disputed. Supporters point to perceived similarities between certain ethical teachings. Critics respond that similar moral concepts can emerge independently across different cultures and that resemblance alone does not establish contact. The strongest challenge facing these theories is the absence of contemporary evidence. No first-century source confirms such travels. No archaeological discovery places Jesus outside the Eastern Mediterranean world. Yet dismissing these ideas entirely presents its own difficulty. History occasionally surprises us. Absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. This is why many scholars neither accept nor completely dismiss such possibilities. Instead, they classify them according to the strength of available data. What makes these interpretations fascinating is not necessarily their likelihood. It is the question they reveal beneath the question. Why have generations felt compelled to imagine Jesus as a traveler between civilizations? Perhaps because the silence of the historical record creates a vacuum into which every age projects its own hopes, fears, and search for hidden wisdom. Yet the debate remains open, balanced uneasily between imagination and evidence. At this stage of the investigation, two fundamentally different interpretations emerge from the evidence, and understanding the tension between them may be more important than choosing a side. The first interpretation is often called the historical continuity model. According to this view, the missing years are not mysterious because of what happened, but because of what did not happen. The strongest evidence supporting this position comes from the earliest sources themselves. The Gospels place Jesus in Nazareth before his ministry and provide no clear indication of extraordinary travels, secret initiations, or hidden teachers. Many historians argue that the simplest explanation remains the most convincing. Jesus spent these years immersed in ordinary Jewish life, learning scripture, participating in community worship, working as a craftsman, and gradually developing the intellectual and spiritual framework that would later define his public ministry. The strength of this theory lies in its consistency with the available evidence. Its weakness is that it leaves many questions unanswered. The second interpretation takes the silence itself as a clue. Some scholars and independent researchers argue that such a large gap in the record may conceal experiences not preserved by the canonical texts. They point toward later traditions, non-canonical writings, and possible cultural influences that appear difficult to explain through isolation alone. According to this perspective, the missing years may have included journeys, encounters, or intellectual exchanges now lost to history. The strength of this theory is its willingness to explore possibilities beyond the surviving record. Its weakness is that the supporting evidence is often indirect, late, or highly contested. Neither interpretation completely solves the mystery. One is supported by stronger evidence, but leaves a profound silence. The other attempts to explain the silence, but often relies on uncertain foundations. This is where the investigation becomes most interesting. We are no longer asking what we would like to believe. We are asking what the evidence can actually sustain. And perhaps the deeper question is this: if the historical record remains silent, should that silence be treated as evidence of ordinary years, or as evidence that something important has been lost forever? If the written sources fall silent, archaeology becomes our next witness. Yet archaeology speaks differently than texts. It does not tell stories. It reveals fragments, stones, foundations, pottery, inscriptions. The challenge is learning how to listen. The strongest archaeological echoes connected to the missing years of Jesus are not dramatic discoveries hidden beneath desert sands. They are the ordinary remains of the world in which he lived. Excavations at Nazareth have revealed a small agricultural settlement consistent with the period described by the Gospels. Stone houses carved into the hillside, storage pits, ritual vessels associated with Jewish purity practices. Nothing about the site suggests wealth or political influence. In some ways, that simplicity is itself significant. It places the early life of Jesus within a community deeply rooted in Jewish tradition. Nearby lies Sepphoris, one of the most important archaeological sites in Galilee. During the years when Jesus would have been growing up, the city underwent extensive reconstruction. Magnificent villas, marketplaces, administrative buildings, and public spaces emerged from the hills. Some scholars have suggested that craftsmen and laborers from surrounding villages, including Nazareth, may have worked there. The archaeological record cannot confirm that Jesus ever entered the city. Yet its physical presence reminds us that the world around Nazareth was more connected and culturally diverse than older assumptions once suggested. Beyond Galilee, the Dead Sea Scrolls provide another intriguing echo. These manuscripts never mention Jesus directly. Nevertheless, they reveal the religious atmosphere of the era, expectations of divine intervention, debates over purity, interpretations of prophecy, and hopes for a coming deliverer. They do not explain the missing years, but they illuminate the intellectual and spiritual landscape in which those years unfolded. The evidence remains indirect. No inscription records where Jesus spent these decades. No manuscript fills the silence. What archaeology offers instead is something subtler. Not a biography, a setting, not an answer, a world. And sometimes understanding the world is the closest we can come to understanding the person who emerged from it. To modern readers, the silence surrounding the early life of Jesus often appears as a problem waiting to be solved. Yet for many people living in the ancient world, the question itself may have seemed far less important than we assume. This is where theology begins to illuminate what history alone cannot fully explain. Ancient Jewish and early Christian writers were not primarily concerned with constructing detailed biographies. Their goal was to reveal meaning. In their worldview, a person's significance was measured less by the chronology of their life and more by their role within the unfolding story of God's relationship with humanity. This perspective helps explain why the gospel narratives devote so much attention to the beginning and climax of Jesus' public ministry, while remaining remarkably restrained about the years in between. From a theological standpoint, the missing years may have carried a symbolic function. In the religious imagination of the ancient Near East, periods of preparation often occurred outside public view. Before a prophet spoke, there was silence. Before a king was revealed, there was waiting. Before divine purpose became visible, there was concealment. These patterns appear repeatedly throughout ancient sacred literature. Some scholars argue that the hidden years of Jesus should be understood within this broader narrative framework. Others caution that such interpretations risk imposing literary symbolism onto historical circumstances. Yet, even this disagreement reveals something important about the ancient mindset. Concealment was not necessarily viewed as absence. It could signify preparation, maturation, or divine timing. Theologically, the silence also shifts attention away from curiosity and toward identity. The Gospel writers seem less interested in answering every historical question than in presenting a particular understanding of who Jesus was and what his mission represented. For ancient audiences, that distinction mattered deeply. The central issue was not where he had traveled or what occupations he pursued during those years. The central issue was the meaning of his appearance when the time came. In that sense, the missing years function almost like a veil, not to hide information, but to direct attention toward a larger theological question. When history and destiny finally intersect, what truly makes a life significant? As our investigation approaches its deepest layer, the mystery of the missing years begins to transcend the question of Jesus himself and enters a much older territory, the limits of human knowledge. Ancient people lived in a world filled with absences. Most lives vanished without record. Most conversations disappeared into silence. Most hopes, fears, and struggles left no inscription upon stone. History preserved kings, wars, temples, and disasters. It rarely preserved the hidden years in which a human being became who they were. Perhaps this is why the silence surrounding Jesus has generated such fascination. It confronts us with the same uncertainty that surrounded countless forgotten lives of antiquity. We stand before a gap in the record and instinctively wish to fill it. Yet the gap resists us. The documents fall silent. The archaeology reaches its limits. The theories multiply. And beyond a certain point, certainty dissolves into probability. This tension would not have been unfamiliar to ancient thinkers. Across many traditions of the ancient world, wisdom began with the recognition that reality exceeded human understanding. The visible world hinted at deeper meanings, but never revealed them completely. The sacred was not something fully possessed. It was something approached, something contemplated, something that remained partly hidden beyond the horizon of knowledge. The missing years, therefore, become more than a historical puzzle. They become a meditation on absence itself. We often imagine that truth emerges only through what survives. Yet sometimes truth is revealed through what remains concealed. The silence forces us to confront an uncomfortable possibility, that complete knowledge may be unattainable, not because the answers do not exist, but because human beings encounter the past only through fragments. In that sense, the mystery is not a failure of history. It is a reminder of history's nature. Every generation inherits broken pieces of a much larger story and attempts to reconstruct a world it can never fully see. And perhaps the longing to cross that distance, to understand what lies beyond the surviving evidence, is itself one of the oldest spiritual impulses in human civilization. After examining the surviving texts, the archaeological landscape of Galilee, the forgotten traditions, the competing theories, and the symbolic language embedded within the narrative, we arrive at a conclusion that is both simpler and more profound than many expect. The central revelation of the missing years may not be hidden in a lost manuscript, an undiscovered tomb, or an ancient road leading to a distant civilization. It may be hidden within the silence itself. The strongest historical evidence suggests that Jesus spent much of this period within the world that shaped him, the villages, synagogues, traditions, and social realities of first-century Judea and Galilee. Yet history cannot reconstruct those years in detail. The archaeological record provides context, but not biography. The textual evidence provides glimpses, but not a continuous narrative. The later traditions offer possibilities, but rarely certainty. As a result, the mystery remains partially unresolved. Yet the investigation has revealed something important. The missing years occupy a unique position between history and meaning. Historically, they remind us how fragile the survival of information can be. Entire decades can disappear, even from the life of one of the most influential figures in human history. Theologically, they shift attention away from spectacle and toward preparation. Symbolically, they transform obscurity into a stage of significance. Philosophically, they expose the limits of our desire for complete knowledge. My reading of the evidence is that the silence was not necessarily created to conceal a secret. It may instead reflect the priorities of the earliest communities who preserved these traditions. Their concern was not to document every chapter of a life. Their concern was to explain why that life mattered. Yet the debate remains open. The available evidence does not permit absolute certainty, and responsible scholarship must acknowledge that boundary. What we can say is this: the missing years are not merely an empty space between two events. They are a reminder that the forces shaping history often operate long before history begins paying attention. And perhaps that is the deepest revelation hidden within the silence. And so we arrive at the edge of the record. The manuscripts fall silent. The stones of Galilee offer no final testimony. The roads that once crossed Judea disappear into the dust of centuries. We have followed every trace that history allows us to follow. We have examined the surviving texts, listened to the echoes of archaeology, weighed competing theories, and explored the symbolic and theological meanings hidden within the silence. Yet one mystery remains untouched. Not because the evidence is weak, not because the question is unimportant, but because some mysteries seem to grow larger the closer we approach them. Perhaps the most intriguing question is no longer where Jesus spent those missing years. Perhaps the deeper question is why generations have felt compelled to search for them. Why do historians continue to investigate? Why do theologians continue to debate? Why do readers continue to return to the same silence, century after century, hoping to hear something hidden within it? It may be that the missing years represent more than a gap in a biography. They may represent a boundary beyond which history cannot easily pass. A place where evidence ends and interpretation begins. A place where certainty gives way to contemplation. If that is true, then the mystery of the missing years is not merely about Jesus of Nazareth. It is also about the human desire to understand what remains unseen behind every great life and every great story. To everyone who has joined this investigation through forgotten scriptures, thank you for walking these ancient roads with curiosity, patience, and intellectual honesty. If you are a historian, theologian, archaeologist, researcher, or simply a thoughtful reader of ancient texts, your perspective is part of this ongoing conversation. Perhaps the strongest interpretation has been presented. Perhaps an important clue still waits unnoticed within the evidence. Yet the debate remains open. And as the final page closes, one question continues to linger in the silence. Was history preserving a secret, or was the silence itself the message all along?